Section 701.10 of the National Electrical Code, or NEC, addresses multiple transfer switches in emergency systems. The core question is whether a single transfer switch can supply both legally required standby loads and optional standby loads, or if separate transfer switches are mandated. There are differing interpretations. Firstly, the opinion is that separate transfer switches are required. Proponents of this view assert that Section 701.10 necessitates separate transfer switches for legally required standby loads and optional standby loads. The reasoning behind this stance is rooted in the code's intent to guarantee the continuous availability of critical loads during power outages, irrespective of the status of non-essential loads. Employing a shared transfer switch for both types of loads could potentially jeopardize the reliability of the critical loads. Legally required standby loads are those essential for safety and are often mandated by law, such as emergency lighting and fire pumps. Optional standby loads, on the other hand, are non-essential and provide convenience or business continuity but are not legally required for safety. Secondly, the opinion is that a shared transfer switch may be permitted. Some argue that Section 701.6, which permits the sharing of enclosures for transfer switches, could be extended to allow the sharing of the transfer switches themselves. However, this interpretation is generally considered less supportable based on the precise wording of the code. Section 701.6 explicitly permits the sharing of enclosures and equipment within those enclosures, but it does not extend this permission to equipment located outside of the enclosures. Therefore, this interpretation does not provide a basis for sharing transfer switches. The crux of the debate lies in the interpretation of the code's language and intent. Those favoring separate transfer switches emphasize the need to protect critical loads, while those open to shared switches point to potential cost savings and space efficiency. However, the prevailing interpretation among electrical inspectors tends to favor the more conservative approach of separate transfer switches to ensure maximum reliability for legally required standby loads. It is crucial to understand the definitions of legally required standby systems, optional standby systems, and emergency systems as defined by the NEC. Legally required standby systems are intended to automatically supply power to specific loads when there is a loss of normal power supply. These systems are required by law or by a governmental agency for the safety of life and property. Optional standby systems are intended to supply power to optional loads that are not necessarily critical for safety but are important for business continuity or convenience. These systems are not legally required. Emergency systems are intended to automatically supply illumination, power, or both to designated areas and equipment essential for safety of life when the normal power supply fails. These systems are legally required and are intended to provide power for a limited time until the normal power supply can be restored. When designing and installing standby power systems, it is essential to consult with local electrical inspectors and authorities having jurisdiction to ensure compliance with all applicable codes and regulations. The consequences of misinterpreting or misapplying the NEC can be significant, potentially leading to safety hazards, equipment damage, and legal liabilities. A comprehensive understanding of the NEC is paramount for electrical engineers, contractors, and inspectors involved in the design, installation, and maintenance of electrical systems. The code undergoes regular revisions to address evolving technologies and safety concerns, so staying up to date with the latest edition is crucial. In summary, while some argue for the possibility of sharing transfer switches based on the allowance of shared enclosures, the more widely accepted and enforced interpretation of the NEC 701.10 calls for separate transfer switches for legally required standby loads and optional standby loads. This approach prioritizes the reliability and availability of critical loads during power outages. Always consult with local authorities and adhere to the most conservative interpretation to ensure compliance and safety. Consider the specific application and the criticality of the loads when making decisions about transfer switch configurations. In applications where the legally required standby loads are extremely critical, separate transfer switches provide an extra layer of protection against potential failures or overloading of a shared transfer switch. For less critical applications, a risk assessment may be performed to evaluate the potential consequences of a shared transfer switch configuration. Ultimately, the decision of whether to use separate or shared transfer switches should be based on a thorough understanding of the NEC, the specific requirements of the application, and consultation with qualified electrical professionals. Remember that the goal is to ensure the safe and reliable operation of the electrical system while complying with all applicable codes and regulations. Furthermore, consider the maintenance and testing requirements for transfer switches. Regular testing and maintenance are essential to ensure that the transfer switches will operate correctly when needed. Separate transfer switches may simplify the testing and maintenance process, as each switch can be tested independently without affecting the other loads. Also, consider the available space for installing the transfer switches. Separate transfer switches may require more space than a shared transfer switch. If space is limited, a shared transfer switch may be a more practical solution. However, ensure that the shared transfer switch is adequately sized to handle the combined load of the legally required standby loads and the optional standby loads. The National Electrical Code is a comprehensive set of standards that governs the safe installation of electrical wiring and equipment. It is developed and maintained by the National Fire Protection Association, or NFPA, and is widely adopted by jurisdictions across the United States and other countries. The NEC is updated every 3 years to reflect changes in technology and to address emerging safety concerns. It is essential for electrical professionals to stay current with the latest edition of the NEC to ensure that their work complies with the most up-to-date safety standard. The NEC covers a wide range of topics, including wiring methods, overcurrent protection, grounding, and equipment installation. It also includes specific requirements for different types of electrical systems, such as emergency systems, standby systems, and healthcare facilities. Compliance with the NEC is essential to prevent electrical hazards such as fires, shocks, and electrocution. It also helps to ensure the reliable operation of electrical systems and equipment. Electrical inspectors are responsible for enforcing the NEC and other applicable electrical codes. They review electrical plans, inspect electrical installations, and issue permits to ensure that electrical work is performed safely and in accordance with the code. It is important to work closely with electrical inspectors throughout the design and installation process to avoid costly rework and delays. The NEC is not a design manual, but it provides the minimum safety requirements for electrical installations. Electrical engineers and designers must use their professional judgment and experience to design electrical systems that are safe, reliable, and efficient. They must also consider the specific needs of the application and the environmental conditions in which the electrical system will operate. In addition to the NEC, there may be other applicable codes and standards that must be followed. These may include local building codes, fire codes, and environmental regulations. It is important to research and understand all applicable codes and standards before beginning any electrical work. The NEC is a complex and technical document, but it is essential for anyone involved in the design, installation, and maintenance of electrical systems. By understanding and complying with the NEC, electrical professionals can help to ensure the safety of people and property. When applying Section 701.10, it is important to consider the specific characteristics of the legally required standby loads and the optional standby loads. For example, if the legally required standby loads are critical for life safety, such as emergency lighting in a hospital, then separate transfer switches are strongly recommended. This ensures that these critical loads will always have power available in the event of a power outage. On the other hand, if the optional standby loads are less critical, such as powering a convenience store during a power outage, then a shared transfer switch may be acceptable, provided that the transfer switch is adequately sized and protected. It is also important to consider the potential for future expansion of the electrical system. If there is a possibility that additional legally required standby loads will be added in the future, then it is wise to install separate transfer switches from the outset. This will avoid the need to replace or reconfigure the transfer switches later on. Another factor to consider is the availability of qualified personnel to maintain and test the transfer switches. Separate transfer switches may require more frequent maintenance and testing than a shared transfer switch. If the facility does not have qualified personnel to perform these tasks, then it may be more cost-effective to use a shared transfer switch. However, it is important to ensure that the shared transfer switch is properly maintained and tested to ensure that it will operate correctly when needed. Finally, it is important to document all decisions related to the selection and installation of transfer switches. This documentation should include a clear explanation of the rationale for the chosen configuration, as well as any assumptions or calculations that were made. This documentation will be helpful for future maintenance and troubleshooting, and it may also be required by electrical inspectors or other authorities having jurisdiction. When selecting a transfer switch, it is important to consider the following factors: voltage rating, current rating, number of poles, type of operation, and environmental conditions. The voltage rating of the transfer switch must be compatible with the voltage of the electrical system. The current rating of the transfer switch must be sufficient to handle the combined load of the legally required standby loads and the optional standby loads. The number of poles of the transfer switch must match the number of poles of the electrical system. The type of operation of the transfer switch can be manual or automatic. Manual transfer switches require a person to manually switch the load from the normal power source to the standby power source. Automatic transfer switches automatically switch the load to the standby power source when the normal power source fails. The environmental conditions in which the transfer switch will operate must be considered when selecting a transfer switch. For example, if the transfer switch will be installed in a damp or corrosive environment, then a transfer switch with an M4X enclosure is recommended. Remember to consider the specific requirements of the application, consult with qualified electrical professionals, and document all decisions to ensure compliance with the NEC and other applicable codes and standards. This approach will help to ensure the safe and reliable operation of the standby power system.